Well, my name's Aaron Judkins. I work here at the Creation Evidence Museum, among other things I do. But I have a degree in biblical archaeology, and I love working at the museum. Anything to do with history and science, I really took a liking at a young age. And my grandparents were rock hounds, and it really got me started looking for fossils and rocks and just curious and things like that. And so when I moved to Glenrose in 1997, the museum was in the temporary facilities, and I came to visit. I came to visit in 1996 and actually saw the first excavation down on the Paluxy. And then when I moved the very next year, really not knowing that I was going to be involved in any of this work, I initially saw the footprints and the tracks, and it really intrigued me. And that led me on a 15-year journey to really delve into this and just to see if this was really true, was this authentic? And if it was, why wasn't this, being taught? What was the holdup? How come the academic community wasn't, using this information? And I didn't have any idea of the creation-evolution debate, really. I had no idea how to reconcile biblical creation with what I'd been taught in public school of the evolutionary concept. So this was all brand new to me. I continued my research, and Dr. Ball had asked me to come on one of the digs, and I thought that's the key, because if this is faked, then those digs, there's got to be some evidence that they're either fake or authentic. And when I went down on my first excavation and started realizing the technique, the manpower, the precision it takes to remove the overburden, the 12 to 14 inches of limestone, and excavate through all that dirt and underneath, it's incredible. And I quickly realized that there's no way that you can fake a track like that. These are brand new tracks coming out, being exposed for the first time. And I'll never forget the feeling of excavating my first dinosaur track in 1997 was just amazing, because I knew with my own two hands and my own eyes that I was excavating this and that this research was real. And of course, when the first human footprint was excavated, not by me, but by someone else, and I saw the excavation firsthand, and I saw the print coming to light and the clay being removed out of it, I knew right there that I was convinced. And I was still skeptical up to that point, but I was convinced from that point on that man and dinosaur lived at the same time. Well, that led me into the research in 1999 with Dr. Ball in the museum. And the work on the Taylor Trail was exposed. It was sandbagged, and I, along with Dr. Patton and Dr. Ball and a number of other volunteers, worked very hard on the Taylor Trail that summer, doing continuing research. And we were down there for days and weeks, cleaning the bottom of the river. Matter of fact, I lived on the river for weeks. And I would just go sit on the front porch and visit Jacob and Dorothy McFall. They were so gracious to have us. And it was important to maintain that relationship with them, because they had opened up their property for us to come through there and excavate along the banks where Stan Taylor had initially filmed in 1969 the footprints in stone video. And so it was really intriguing research for me, because I was still in the process of investigation. And even though I was convinced in 97 and 98 of the footprints being real, I still hadn't studied the Taylor Trail really extensively. And in 1999, Dr. Patton and I exposed for the first time the Upper Taylor Platform, or the McFall Trail. And we exposed over 100 dinosaur tracks and a series of 15 human footprints. And in track number 4 specifically, I was right there. Dr. Patton and I had the brooms and the brushes, and we had cleared the area. And with our paint brushes, with our dry brushes that we used to clean the prints off with, we just dry brushed the dirt away to clean it and expose it. And right in front of me appeared a human footprint within a dinosaur footprint on the Upper McFall platform. I knew that that evidence was authentic. This research was real on the paluxy. And that led me into the question, well, is there any other evidence worldwide for fossil footprints in stone? Because there was a lot of controversy surrounding the Paluxy River. And when I would talk to people about it, they would say, well, the Paluxy River, the tracks have been faked. We don't believe it. It's, not authentic. And as these reports were coming around the world, I began to gather information, and I would say, well, what about the tracks in Italy? Or what about the tracks in France or Mexico or Australia? No one knew about those. And that led me to gather the research to say, wait a minute, this isn't an isolated phenomenon to Glenrose. This is a worldwide phenomenon found on every continent of the world. As a matter of fact, different states in the U.S. have footprint sites. And so I began to realize that Glenrose wasn't the only footprint site that there ever was. I was astounded to find out that these tracks were found not by creationists, but by secular geologists, archaeologists, people who were every day in the field working. Common people would come across these fossil footprint sites and they would be reported. Now, unfortunately, these footprint sites are often interpreted under the evolutionary uniformitarian view, and so they have long ages associated with them. But if the evidence doesn't match up with the theory, then the theory has to be dismissed, and a suitable alternative framework has to be explored. White Sands, New Mexico in 1931, there was a man by the name of Ellis Wright. He was a government tracker near Alamogordo, New Mexico. And he was out and he found a series of 13 fossilized human footprints. Now, these tracks were 22 inches long, and they had a stride of 4 to 5 feet apart. Now, a person that size is pushing 8 feet tall plus. There were other accounts in Kentucky and Tennessee, and there's an account of the Meister footprint. In 1968, William Meister, he was an amateur fossil collector, and he was out in Utah looking for trilobites. And he had his pastiche, and he was out on the mountain, and he found a rock. He chipped it open with his pastiche, about 2 inches thick. And this rock, to his astonishment, he found a human fossil sandal footprint. When he began to look at it, he realized that it was a right footprint. The heel was embedded just a little bit deeper, and so he concluded that it was a right footprint. There was stitching along the sides of the print, but there was something very weird about the Meister footprint. In the toe and the heel of this fossil footprint was embedded and crushed 2 trilobites. Now, what's a trilobite? A trilobite is a little marine creature that lived 300 million years ago. Now, this is astounding, because if this is a human fossil single footprint, that should not be in 300 million year old rock. Now we have a problem. The evolutionary community can't answer for it because they have to push man back some 300 million years ago, which they can't do and they won't do, or the dating and the technique they use to date the rock is totally in disarray. In Hawaii in 1919, Ry Finch, who was a geologist, in the desert ash and the pyroclastic flows, discovered a series of human fossil footprints. Now, this volcanic ash, this tuff, has known to have exploded around the year 1500, all the way up through about the last eruption was about 1780. So this is a known witnessed event. We know when these eruptions took place. And the dating techniques that they use to date this, they can't carbon date it, but they try to use potassium argon dating to date this rock to see how old these are. And in the potassium argon date, they got 13 to 29 million years old. Now, there's a real issue here because, again, the dating techniques is not lining up with the evidence. Certainly, there wasn't people 13 to 29 million years ago walking around, and even the evolutionary academics will tell you that. So these flows aren't millions of years of old. They are relatively recent, and we know because it's a witnessed account of these volcanic flows. Another account is in Nicaragua, in Acahulinca, in 1874. Earl Flint found a series of a number of trackways, 3 different trackways, under 16 to 24 feet of overburden with 11 strata of rock over these footprints. Now, these are some of the best preserved footprints that I've ever seen. I think they're better than the ones in the paluxy that are on the Taylor Trail, with the exception of -3B. But the footprints in Nicaragua was outstanding. And they initially dated to 200,000 years old. Now, that's important because they tried to relate that to an early age so they can classify it as archaic Homo sapien. But 200,000 years old isn't a correct date. What do they do? Because the dating that they use, still 200,000 years old, is still not in the correct time frame. So over the years, they redated it, and in the 1970s, they got a date at 5,945 years old, which roughly puts it back to 3000 BC. That is more close to the biblical account of creation and the flood than it is evolutionary time frame. These people didn't walk around hominids as our great ancestors coming up through evolutionary time, swinging down from trees. These were normal human beings walking around. And it's interesting because the human foot has never changed. You would think after eons of evolutionary time that the human foot would change. The defining characteristic is bipedalism. And Professor Robert Crompton specifically ran studies from Liverpool University showing that bipedalism could have never occurred by means of evolution. Now, that's a secular scientist saying that. They can't account for bipedalism. There's no evolutionary advantage to it. Matter of fact, you have to not only restructure the foot, but you have to restructure the nerves and the muscles and the anatomy of your backbone just to have upright stance and balance. So all these things have to come together in design at the same time, not over millions of years of eons of time. this overburden in these footprints in Nicaragua, because it was under 16 to 24 foot strata and 11 layers of rock, proves empirically that that was buried catastrophically. It doesn't prove eons and millions of years of time. Just like the prints in Glenrose. See, the prints in Glenrose aren't accepted, but the prints at Laetoli, Africa are. And that's according to secular scientists. How do they determine what a footprint is? Well, they look at arches, they look at characteristics of the human foot. Does it have a big toe, which is the distinguishing factor of human feet? We have no opposable big toes. And so the trackways in Laetoli show these characteristics, but yet they aren't as defined nor as clear as the fossil footprints here in Glenrose. Yet they're not accepted. There seems to be an issue, because Mary Leakey was able to define the footprints as made by Australopithecus afarensis, dating to 3.6 million years ago. That was against the opinion of the world's foremost expert in forensic footprint anatomy, Dr. Luis Robbins from North Carolina, flew to Laetoli, and he concluded, after studying, that they were no different than modern human feet. Mary Leakey didn't like that answer, and she sent him on a plane back home. So it's all in how you interpret your evidence. If you interpret it through a presupposition of evolutionary time, you can get whatever age you want. And you can assign it to any hominid classification you want. However, if you look at it through a presuppositional view of the biblical account has never changed. The written record has always remained the same. There was a flood, and it was because of judgment on the earth. And that judgment was because of sin. And those people who missed the boat were left on the earth in that judgment, in a global deluge, along with all the animals, save the ones who were on the ark. And it's not just about dinosaurs or dinosaur tracks or even human fossil footprints. What it's really about, it's about, are you going to miss the next judgment? Because, see, all this represents a judgment on the ancient earth, the past earth. I say ancient, but just to say that in the world that then was, has now changed because of the Great Deluge. It's interesting, when they date the rocks, they can't simply, there's no simple technique to date rocks, and Dr. Patton will tell you that. You can't carbon-14 it, date it. There's just no good way to do it, but rock has a lot of potassium in it, and they can try to date it that way. What they don't tell people is when they use potassium argon dating, and this blew me away, that they can get whatever age they want because they have to assume variables into the equation, just like they do carbon-14, let's say. And argon is an unstable gas, and it can float from rock to rock, in and out. It's so unstable, it's hard to measure it. Well, what about the potassium in the rock? You can leach potassium out of rock with distilled water in 4.5 hours. What does that do to the potassium argon dating technique? That totally throws it in disarray. That falsifies the potassium argon dating technique. So potassium argon technique is a very unreliable dating technique. And when you can leach potassium out of rock in 4.5 hours, that ought to tell you something. But they don't tell people that. People don't know that. There are fossil footprints in almost every continent of the world. We find them in Asia. We find them in Africa, South Africa. We find them in France, Italy, Australia, Mexico, Central America. We find footprints in Nicaragua. some of the footprints here locally are in Glen Rose. We also find them in Tennessee and in Kentucky, in Oklahoma, in Utah, in Arizona, in Colorado. And so this isn't really isolated to Glen Rose. These fossil footprints can be found on a global scale in many different parts of the world. One of my favorite footprint sites is in Mexico. Dr. Sylvia Gonzalez, who's a geologist in Mexico, found 263 fossil human footprints in central Mexico. Now, she's a secular geologist. She went forward with her findings, and it was a big uproar. People were ecstatic about the findings, and people were excited. She brought in other of her colleagues. They all authenticated that they were certainly human fossil footprints, but they dated them to 40,000 years. Well, all of a sudden the excitement stopped. 40,000 years is a problem because, people didn't come through people weren't supposed to be around in central Mexico at that time period. That really goes against the Clovis first model, that people came through the Bering Land Strait and walked down to central Mexico. That date is not correct. So what did they do? They decided, well, we have to redate this. So they redated the footprints using optically stimulated luminescence dating, which dates the sand grains in the rock. And they got 1.3 million years old. Now they really have a problem now because they can't account for either one of those dates. So what they have to do is they have to say, well, either humans walked around in this rock strata 1.3 million years ago in central Mexico, which totally goes against this Clovis first model, or they have to discount the prints altogether. And that's exactly what they did. They discounted those prints, and they just said, you know what? Those prints are not prints after all. They're just pock marks, and we're sorry, we're mistaken, but all the evidence that we've showed you and all the studies that we did and we've published, they're really not real. They're just pock marks. Their story changes all the time.
Yeah.
I've been studying the fossil footprints here along the paluxy since 1997, and I'm convinced that empirically the evidence verifies that man and dinosaur did walk at the same time and lived contemporaneously.